The diner door opened at 6 in the morning and a man in Marine Corps dress walked in with his hand resting on the shoulder of someone in handcuffs. The room went quiet. Coffee cups stopped halfway to mouths. The man in cuffs did not look up. He did not speak English. He did not speak at all, not to the commander, not to the guards outside, not to anyone who had tried for 3 days straight. Somewhere in that silence sat a secret that could end a career or save a life. What happens next will change how this whole town sees the quiet woman behind the counter. Grab a coffee of your own, because this one takes its time to unfold, and it earns every minute. Alina Voss had worked the early shift at the Miller Creek Diner for 6 years. She wiped down the counter before the first customer walked in, same as she did every morning, and she kept her sleeves down even in summer. Nobody in town asked why. People in Miller Creek learned a long time ago that Alina did not talk about herself, and most of them respected that, or at least they pretended to. She poured coffee, she remembered orders, and she smiled just enough to be kind without inviting questions. Her apartment sat above the hardware store, small and plain, with one photograph on the wall that nobody had ever seen up close. Her mornings followed a pattern that felt more like a ritual than a job. She arrived before sunrise, unlocked the back door, and turned on the grill exactly 4 minutes before the coffee finished brewing. She liked the quiet of that window, the town still asleep, the light still gray outside the windows. She kept a small notebook in her apron pocket, and every so often she would write a single word in a language nobody in Miller Creek recognized. If anyone asked, she said it was a recipe note. Nobody ever pushed past that answer, because something in her voice told them not to. The town itself was small enough that everyone thought they knew everyone. Miller Creek sat 40 minutes from the nearest Marine Corps base, close enough that trucks and convoys passed through on their way to the training range, far enough that most locals treated the base like a distant weather system. Once in a while, a uniform would show up at the diner, order eggs, and leave a good tip. Alina always served them the same way she served anyone else. Calm, efficient, unreadable. If she recognized any of the insignia on their collars, she never said so out loud. Her boss, a heavy-set man named Frank who owned the diner, liked to joke that Alina was the best hire he never had to train. She showed up knowing how to run a kitchen line like she had done it in a war zone. Frank meant it as a compliment. He had no idea how close his joke sat to something true. Alina let the comment pass with a small nod, the same nod she gave to most things that came too near the truth. She kept her past folded up small, tucked behind her ribs where nobody could reach it. On the particular morning this story turns on, the sky was still dark when Alina heard engines on the highway outside town, more of them than usual, moving slow and heavy like they were escorting something. She did not think much of it at first. Trucks passed through Miller Creek all the time, but something about the rhythm of the engines made her pause with a coffee pot halfway to a cup, her eyes drifting toward the window for just a second longer than usual. Old habits do not fully sleep. They only wait. If a story like this one keeps pulling you in, tap that like button now, because Alina's morning is about to get a lot more complicated. By 7 that morning, 3 men walked into the diner and took the corner booth like they owned it. They were loud before they even sat down, laughing about something from the night before, boots scraping the floor, one of them slapping a phone down on the table so hard the salt shaker jumped. Alina recognized the type immediately. She had served men like this for years, men who mistook volume for confidence, and she had learned long ago that the fastest way through a shift like this was patience worn like armor. The leader of the group was a man named Curtis Doyle, broad-shouldered, quick to laugh at his own jokes, quicker to notice when nobody else laughed with him. He ran a small trucking operation outside town and liked people to know it. His 2 friends, Randy and Shane, followed his lead the way dogs follow a hand holding meat. They ordered coffee before Alina even reached the table, and Curtis snapped his fingers twice, like she was something to summon rather than someone to ask. Alina poured their coffee without comment. She had heard worse. She had survived worse. A snapped finger from a man like Curtis Doyle barely registered on a scale that once included artillery fire in the distance and silence that meant something had gone terribly wrong nearby. She set the cups down, took their order, and moved on, her face giving away nothing. Curtis watched her walk away. Why, and made a comment to his friends low enough that Alina could not hear the words, only the tone. And the tone told her everything she needed to know. Randy leaned back in the booth and stared at Alina a beat too long as she worked the counter. Shane laughed at something Curtis said and glanced over his shoulder toward her, then away, like a boy testing whether a teacher noticed him whispering. Small moments like these rarely mean much on their own. Strung together across a morning, they start to form a pattern, the kind of pattern Alina had learned to read the way other people read weather. She kept pouring coffee. She kept her voice level. She kept working. What none of the 3 men noticed, and what almost nobody in Miller Creek ever noticed, was the way Alina's eyes moved across a room. She was not watching them out of nervousness. She was watching them out of habit, the same habit that once kept her alive in places far from any diner. Her eyes swept the door, the windows, the exits, every time someone new walked in. It was not fear. It was training so old it had become instinct, the kind that never fully leaves a person, no matter how many years of quiet mornings try to bury it. Curtis raised his voice again, this time complaining loudly about the wait for his food, loud enough that a few other customers glanced up from their plates. Alina told him calmly that his order would be up soon. Her tone was even professional, the kind of tone meant to diffuse rather than provoke. Curtis did not take it that way. He leaned toward his friends and said something that made Randy snort into his coffee. Alina felt the heat of it land on the back of her neck, but she did not turn around. She had learned a long time ago that turning around only feeds a fire like that. If you have ever worked a job where you had to swallow more than you should have, you already know the exact silence Alina was carrying that morning. Stick around, because this diner is about to get a visitor nobody in that booth is prepared for. The bell above the door rang differently than it had all morning, a sharper sound, like it had been pushed rather than nudged. Every head in the diner turned, including Curtis and his two friends, mid-laugh, mid-complaint. A man in Marine Corps dress stood in the doorway, tall, square-shouldered, his uniform sharp enough to catch the early light. Behind him, flanked by two younger Marines, walked a second man in plain clothes, his wrists bound in front of him, his eyes down, his face unreadable in a way that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with exhaustion. The commander scanned the diner once, the way people trained to read rooms always do, taking in exits, faces, and the general temperature of the place in under 2 seconds. He walked to the counter, his boots steady on the tile, and asked Frank if there was somewhere private they could sit for 20 minutes. Frank, flustered, pointed toward the back booth near the kitchen, and the small group moved through the diner in a tight, quiet line. The prisoner never lifted his eyes from the floor the entire walk. Curtis, never one to let a moment pass without comment, muttered something to his friends about the show currently playing out in front of them. Randy laughed. Shane did not, his eyes lingering a little longer on the man in cuffs, something like unease crossing his face before he masked it with a smirk to match his friends. Alina watched all of it from behind the counter, her hands steady on the coffee pot, her face giving away nothing at all, though something behind her eyes had shifted the moment the second man walked through that door. She recognized the language the moment the commander spoke a single soft phrase to the bound man, trying and failing to get any response. It was not English, it was not Spanish. It was a dialect Alina had heard exactly one other time in her life, years ago in a place far from Miller Creek, spoken by people who had trusted her with their lives because she could speak it back to them. Her pulse did not race. It did something quieter and older than that. It settled the way a compass needle settles once it finally finds north. The commander tried 3 more phrases, each one met with the same silence, the same downward stare from the bound man. His jaw tightened. Whatever brought him into this diner instead of a secure facility clearly mattered more than convenience. Time was working against him, that much was obvious in the way he kept checking his watch, in the way his voice carried the strain of a man running out of options in a town that had none to offer him. If a moment like this has ever made you hold your breath without noticing, that is exactly the reaction this story is built to earn. Keep watching, because Alina has not moved yet, but she is about to. Curtis, still riding the high of his own commentary, raised his voice loud enough to cut across the diner, joking that maybe the pris. Oner just did not feel like talking to strangers. Randy laughed again, sharper this time, and Shane added something about the Marines needing better interrogation methods, his voice carrying just enough mockery to draw a hard look from one of the young Marines standing near the booth. The commander did not turn around. He had bigger problems than 3 loud men in a corner booth. Alina set down the coffee pot. She untied her apron with slow, deliberate hands, folding it once and laying it on the counter the way someone lays down a tool they no longer need for the task ahead. Frank noticed and opened his mouth to ask what she was doing, but something in her posture stopped him before the question left his throat. She walked toward the back booth, her steps even, her spine straighter than anyone in that diner had ever seen it. She stopped at the edge of the table and spoke, quietly, in the same dialect the commander had just failed to get an answer with. The bound man's head snapped up for the first time since he had walked through the door. His eyes, dull and closed off moments before, sharpened into something close to disbelief. He answered her, hesitant at first, his voice cracked from disuse, and Alina answered back without a single beat of hesitation, like she was picking up a conversation paused years ago rather than starting one from nothing. The commander turned toward her fully now, his expression somewhere between confusion and something close to hope. He asked her carefully how a diner waitress in a town like Miller Creek came to speak a language that most linguists in the country would need weeks to identify correctly. Alina did not answer right away. She kept her eyes on the bound man, reading his face the way she used to read faces for a living, searching for the details that mattered more than words ever could. Curtis, from the corner booth, laughed loud enough to break the moment, calling out that the waitress was putting on quite a show for the Marines. Randy joined in. Shane, this time, stayed quiet, his eyes moving between Alina and the bound man with something new in his expression, something closer to the beginning of understanding than to mockery. Something is about to surface in this diner that none of these three men expected, and it is bigger than any of them realized. If you want the next reveal to land the way it should, subscribe now so you do not miss where this goes. Alina finally turned toward the commander and told him plainly that she had spent 4 years as a combat interpreter attached to a Marine unit overseas, working in the same region and the same dialect the bound man in front of them had just spoken. She told him her call sign had once been Whisper, given to her because she moved through rooms and conversations without anyone noticing she was there until the moment it mattered most. The commander's expression shifted from disbelief into something like recognition, the kind that comes when a name from an old file suddenly attaches itself to a real face standing in front of you. She rolled up her left sleeve without being asked, revealing a tattoo she had kept hidden under diner uniforms for 6 straight years, a small emblem inked just above her wrist, the kind given only to interpreters who had completed a specific and dangerous rotation few people ever heard about. The commander's eyes lingered on it, and something in his posture changed, the professional distance replaced by something closer to respect earned rather than assumed. He asked her quietly if she would be willing to help, right there, right now, in a diner booth instead of a secure interrogation room 3 hours away. Alina knelt slightly to be at eye level with the bound man, and she spoke to him again, this time longer, this time gentler, the words moving like something rehearsed 100 times in a different life. The man's shoulders, tight since the moment he had walked through the door, began to lower just slightly, the posture of someone finally hearing a voice he trusted after days of hearing only voices he did not. He answered her in longer sentences now, his eyes wet, his hands trembling slightly against the cuffs holding them together. The diner had gone almost completely silent, every customer watching without pretending not to, even Curtis, who had stopped laughing somewhere in the last 2 minutes without noticing he had done it. Alina translated for the commander in real time, her voice calm and clipped, the professional cadence of someone who had done this exact work under conditions far worse than a diner booth at 7 in the morning. She explained that the bound man had once served as an ally interpreter himself, embedded with American forces years earlier, and that a paperwork error, not a crime, had landed him in custody after a border stop flagged an old file nobody had bothered to update. The commander's jaw tightened again, this time not from frustration but from the weight of realizing how close his unit had come to holding an innocent ally for days over a clerical mistake that only Alina, in this entire chain of command, had the ability to untangle. He thanked her formally, the way Marines thank people who just saved them from a mistake too large to undo quietly. Alina waved it off, her voice steady, though something behind her eyes carried the exhaustion of a memory she had not let herself visit in a long time. Randy from the corner booth finally spoke, his voice smaller now than it had been all morning, asking Curtis if he had known any of this about the woman who poured their coffee every single day for years. Curtis did not answer. His eyes stayed fixed on Alina, on the tattoo still visible on her forearm on the calm, commanding way she had just handled a Marine Corps commander and a frightened, wrongfully held man without raising her voice once. If you have ever underestimated someone quiet in your own life, you already know exactly what is happening in that diner right now. Drop a comment with the name of the quiet person in your life who turned out to be the strongest one in the room. The bound man, no longer bound in spirit even with the cuffs still on his wrists, looked at Alina with an expression that needed no translation at all, gratitude sitting plainly across his face. Alina asked the commander in English now to have the cuffs removed, explaining calmly that this man had bled for the same flag the Marines standing in that diner now wore, years before any paperwork error had ever confused a system that owed him better. The commander nodded once, sharp and final, and gave the order himself. The two young Marines flanking the booth moved quickly, and the cuffs came off with a small metallic click that seemed to echo louder than it should have in a room gone completely silent. The bound man rubbed his wrist slowly, his eyes never leaving Alina, like he was still confirming she was real and not something conjured out of exhaustion and hope. He spoke again, longer this time, and Alina's eyes softened as she listened, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder the way someone reassures another person that the worst has finally passed. She translated his words for the room, explaining that he had spent 3 days assuming nobody left in this country remembered people like him, assuming the language that once connected him to safety had disappeared along with the mission that used it. Hearing it spoken back to him, he said, felt like hearing his own name after years of being called nothing at all. The diner, quiet already, went quieter still, even Frank standing frozen behind the counter with a dish towel forgotten in his hands. Curtis rose from the booth slowly, his bravado gone, replaced by something closer to shame settling heavy across his face. He walked toward the counter, toward Alina, and told her, quietly enough that only she and the people closest could hear, that he owed her an apology for every snapped finger and every careless word tossed her way over the years. Alina looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before nodding once, accepting the apology without needing to make a show of it. The commander turned to Alina and asked professionally but with clear urgency if she would consider consulting on the man's case formally, given how rare her specific language skill was within current military rosters. Alina hesitated, her eyes drifting briefly to the photograph she kept in her apartment above the hardware store, the one nobody had ever seen up close, the one of a unit long since scattered across the country and the world. She told him she would think about it, her voice steady but her hands, for the first time all morning, trembling slightly at her sides. This is the part of the story where everything either falls back into silence or finally moves forward, and Alina has not decided yet. Stay with this one, because the next section shows exactly which way she chooses to go. The rest of that morning passed differently than any morning Miller Creek had seen in years. Word spread fast in a town that small, the way it always does, moving from booth to booth, then store to store, until by lunchtime half the town somehow knew that quiet Alina from the diner had once carried a call sign and a tattoo and 4 years of service most of them could barely imagine. Some people came by just to see her, ordering coffee they did not need, watching her with new eyes, the way people look at something they walked past every day without ever truly seeing. Frank offered to give her the rest of the day off, but Alina shook her head and tied her apron back on, telling him the grill still needed running and the regulars still needed their eggs. It was not stubbornness. It was the same quiet discipline that had carried her through 4 years overseas and 6 years behind that counter, the belief that showing up steady mattered more than any reveal, however dramatic, that had just happened in front of a room full of witnesses. Curtis came back that same afternoon, alone this time, without Randy or Shane trailing behind him. He sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and this time waited quietly for it to arrive instead of snapping his fingers. He told Alina, in a voice much smaller than the one he usually used, that he had spent the whole morning thinking about every assumption he had made about her without ever once asking a real question. Alina poured his coffee and told him simply that people rarely know what someone else has carried, and that the not knowing was not always his fault, only the way he had chosen to treat the not knowing. The bound man, whose name Alina finally shared with the town as Rashid, once he gave his own permission to do so, stayed in Miller Creek for 2 more days while the commander's team corrected the paperwork that had wrongly detained him. Alina visited him each of those 2 days, translating updates from the Marines, sharing quiet conversations in the language that had once connected them across a war zone and now reconnected them across a diner counter. Rashid told her through those conversations that he had spent years assuming the people who once fought beside him had simply moved on and forgotten. Alina told him some of them never really left, not fully, not the parts that mattered most. If a story like this reminds you of someone who deserves a little more patience than they usually get, share it with them, because sometimes a quiet person just needs someone to finally ask the right question. On the 3rd day, a car came to take Rashid to a proper hearing where his status would be formally restored. No longer a prisoner, no longer a mistake sitting in a file somewhere unread. Before he left, he stood outside the diner with Alina, the morning light catching the edge of her tattoo where her sleeve had slipped up slightly, and he told her in their shared language that hearing his own tongue spoken back to him in a stranger's diner had done more for him than any lawyer or commander ever could. Alina told him the language was never really hers to keep quiet forever, only hers to protect until it was needed again. The commander shook Alina's hand before his own departure, formally this time, thanking her again in front of Frank and a small crowd that had gathered outside the diner to watch the car pull away. He left her a card with a name and a number, telling her the door was open if she ever wanted to put her skills back to use in a role that finally matched them. Alina took the card, folded it once, and tucked it into her apron pocket, next to the small notebook she had carried for years, the one filled with words in a language most of Miller Creek had never known existed until this week. Curtis, Randy, and Shane still came into the diner after that, though something between them and Alina had changed permanently. They ordered their coffee politely now, tipped generously, and never once raised their voices toward the counter again. Randy, in particular, took to asking Alina small questions about her service, careful and respectful, the kind of questions people ask when they finally understand they had been standing next to something far larger than they realized for years. Frank, for his part, started introducing Alina to new hires differently, no longer just the best cook he never had to train, but someone whose quiet had always meant something worth respecting rather than overlooking. Alina let the new description settle over her without much comment, the way she let most things settle, though something in the set of her shoulders looked lighter than it had in years, like a weight finally shared instead of carried alone. If this story reached the part of you that still believes in quiet strength, leave a like before you go, because stories like Alina's deserve to travel further than this one diner. Weeks later, Alina still worked the early shift at Miller Creek Diner, still arrived before sunrise, still turned on the grill 4 minutes before the coffee finished brewing. But she no longer kept her sleeves down in summer. and she no longer flinched slightly when a customer asked where she had learned to move so calmly through a crowded room. The photograph on her apartment wall came down eventually, not from shame, but because she finally hung it somewhere she could see it every morning instead of avoiding it every night. She kept the commander's card in a drawer for a long while before finally making the call, choosing at last to put her rare skill back into a life that had room for both quiet diner mornings and the occasional consult that only someone with her exact history could offer. Rashid sent her a letter once his status cleared fully, thanking her again, telling her that language, once spoken between two people who trusted each other, never really disappears no matter how many years or miles try to bury it. Miller Creek went back to its usual rhythm soon enough, trucks passing through toward the training range, regulars filling the same booths every morning. But something had shifted permanently in the way that small town saw its quietest resident, a shift that no loud voice or careless joke ever fully undid again. Alina still poured coffee every morning with the same steady hands, but now the whole town understood exactly what those hands had once carried, and exactly why she had always moved through the world like someone who already knew how much silence could hold. She still writes a single word in her notebook some mornings, in that same quiet language, though now it is not a secret kept from the world, only a habit kept for herself, a small bridge back to a version of her life that finally gets to sit in the light instead of hiding behind an apron. And some mornings, just after sunrise, before the first customer walks through that door, she stands at the window a moment longer than she needs to, watching the road, listening for engines, the old habit settling now not from fear, but from something closer to peace.